Hey everybody, I wanted to go ahead and do a quick video review to make sure that everybody got the information as well as possible before our test tomorrow. So we're going to go over primary and secondary sources first, and then we're going to go over archaeology. So if you want to have your study guide out and ready to go, then let's begin. So for primary sources, the first thing that we need to do is talk about what is a primary source. A primary source is the record of an event written by someone who had seen or experienced the event firsthand. This could be a record in the form of a letter, a picture, a map, a journal or a diary, a newspaper article, a book, or even a manifest list, which would be like a list of people that were in a battle or on a ship. So any of these items would be considered a primary source if the person who was writing it was actually writing about their firsthand experience. So I gave the example in class. If you saw the best football play ever at the football game, and then you wrote a newspaper article about it, that newspaper article would be a primary source. But let's say I didn't get to go, so I read the article, and then I write my mom a letter about what I read in the newspaper. That's not a primary source. My letter is not a primary source. It's a secondary source. The newspaper article is a primary source because you wrote it and you were there firsthand. You saw it with your own eyes. An example of a primary source that we can look at is if we ask the question, who was at the signing of the Declaration of Independence? We would want a primary source to answer this question, or at least a trustworthy source. So that's a question we have to ask ourselves. If it's not a primary source, is it a trustworthy source? So source one here, we gave the example of a Hollywood movie about the American Revolution made in 2001. And source two was a book written by a famous historian who was an expert on the American Revolution, published in 1999. Now, neither one of these is going to be a primary source, but one of them probably used a primary source. So the best source, the one that we would trust more in this situation, would be source number two, the book written by the famous historian who is an expert on the American Revolution and published in 1999. Now the question is why? Why is the source more trustworthy? Well, the answer is this. When you have a movie or a TV show or a video that someone has made, a lot of times the information that it gives you is not going to be as accurate. They can't give you in video form the same kind of details that can be given in written form. That's the first reason. Specifically, Hollywood movies are made to entertain and to make money. They're not made to inform a person. Now, there are some documentaries that are good and trustworthy and accurate, and those would be the exception to the rule. But generally speaking, videos are not going to be the most trustworthy source when it comes to history. Now, the book written by the famous historian is a good source because the purpose of his writing was to educate. Remember, it was there so that he could teach you about the American Revolution. He's studied it for a long time. He's consulted lots of primary sources and might have actually included some primary sources in his history book. So you have to ask yourself, not only is it trustworthy, but what's the reason that the person was writing the source? Was it to entertain you? Was it to educate you? Or maybe there was another reason. Now, when you think about primary sources, there's some questions that we have to ask. We need to ask, who wrote this source? When was it written? Was it written soon after the event, or was it a long time later? And then another question that's important to ask is, what else was going on when this document was written? So we looked at that document written by John Smith, talking about whether or not John Smith had to be rescued by Pocahontas. Well, when we read the one source, we saw that no, really, Pocahontas wasn't involved in it that much. Powhatan and John Smith got along fine. There was no reason for her to rescue him. And then another source said no, there was a big reason for her to rescue him. He was almost killed. We have to look at these questions. Who wrote the sources that we're reading? When was it written? Was it written soon after or a long time later? And then what else was going on with it when this was written to decide which source we would like to trust the most. Now, that's all I have for primary and secondary sources. Up next is archaeology. Okay, now for archaeology. So the first thing we have to ask is, what is archaeology? Remember that archaeology is the study of human behavior in cultures of the past through the recovery and analysis of artifacts. Now, what's an artifact? An artifact is an object left behind from people long ago. So now we have to say, okay, this is archaeology. We know what an artifact is. So what does an archaeologist do? An archaeologist is going to be the one that recovers and analyzes those artifacts. So archaeology is the study of human behavior through these things, and an archaeologist is the one that recovers and analyzes the artifacts. All right. Now, we went through this artifact analysis together as a class, and we asked the questions, what is it? What is it made of? How was it used? Who do we think used it? And what does it tell us about life in this time? So if you remember correctly, this first one was the head of an axe that was used to cut big pieces of wood and make them into smaller pieces of wood. What does that mean for our life in Jamestown? Well, it means that they had to chop their own wood to make things like houses. And we talked about this artifact, which was the handle of a pot, and how that meant that somebody was able to make these ceramic things, and that they used containers when they cooked. Remember, we talked about this coin. Now, these specific artifacts are really not going to be on your test. But being able to look at these and figuring out some of these clues kind of is important. When we talk about specific archaeology, we studied Cactus Hill, Virginia. Now, looking at this map, you can see that the Nottoway River is located there where it's pointing to the letter C. That river is in the southeastern part of the state of Virginia. Now, Cactus Hill, that's the Nottoway River, is an important site because it lets us know how long ago people lived here in Virginia. So the oldest known civilization in North America is where this is. And there's another map here that shows you about where Cactus Hill is, a little bit blurry. And remember, in class we talked about this site, and we said that it was really neat because they were able to find structures here. They were able to find arrowheads and spearheads and things that the people that lived at Cactus Hill had used. And the three things I wanted you to remember about Cactus Hill were that it was the oldest archaeology site in North America. It was located near the Nottoway River, and it was important because now we know how long ago people lived in Virginia. Those are the things you need to know about Cactus Hill. Now, I would like to remind you that you do need to look through your study guide, and you either have a pink one like this or you have a blue one. And just go through and answer the questions. I've answered all of them in this video. So I hope that's been helpful for you. I hope that you're ready for your test tomorrow. And don't forget to bring your homework back to school with you, and I will see you all tomorrow. Have a good evening.